So let's begin with Period 7, which lasts from 1890, which is the McKinley Tariff, to 1917. And in Period 7, we'll be discussing foreign policy. And so we have three topics of discussion for today: Alaska and new imperialism, the Spanish-American War, as well as Hawaii and presidential diplomacies. So let's begin with Alaska and the new imperialism. So Alaska was discovered by Russia and Britain. Well, not discovered. It was owned by Russia and Britain until Russia was able to finally take over, and they set up a seal hunting port town on the mass of land, but they were worried about the British retaking it. And so what they did was they put it up for sale. And then William H. Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson as well as Abraham Lincoln, and so William H. Seward decided that he was going to purchase Alaska. A lot of people made fun of this purchase because of the fact that not only was Alaska cold and barren, but also because they spent more than $7.2 million on that giant mass of land that was only good for seal hunting, whale blubber, all of these which were industries that were not very prevalent in the United States economy. And so many people mocked Seward for this decision, and they called Alaska Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. And so new imperialism is driven by this Gilded Age politics and all of this business orientation. So there are many reasons for this new kind of imperialism. And so one of these reasons is the closing of the frontier. Turner's thesis says that when the frontier was closed, the Americans were always going to keep on searching for new ways to go on adventures. And so one such way would have been to engage in imperialistic behavior such as other nations had in the past. And so some outcomes of this imperialism, so some ways that the United States engaged in this new imperialism were missionaries, like sending Anglo-Saxons to convert other nations to American culture, as well as spread the Christian faith. And you also have the white man's burden, meaning that it was the white man's job to teach other civilizations how to be correctly civilized. So many politicians engaged in this sort of new imperialism because it gave them a way to engage in propaganda to propagate themselves upwards in political status. It makes more sense to vote for a candidate that is heavily patriotic and war-oriented, nationalistic, than it is to vote for a politician that is very meek, calm, and very friendly to other nations. And many Republicans supported this idea of new imperialism. And the popular press, such as newspaper and magazine editors, they found that they could increase the circulation of their news by printing adventure stories about distant and exotic places. Stories in the popular press increased public interest and stimulated demands for a larger U.S. role in world affairs. And so you have this part of new imperialism and nationalism playing a role in the Spanish-American War. And so the Spanish-American War was started because the USS Maine exploded near Cuba. And Cuba at this time was a subjugated colony under the Spanish. And so because there was all this fervent war talk and yellow journalism, which is essentially fake journalism that actively promoted war fever in the United States. It was sensationalistic reporting that featured bold and lurid headlines of crime, disaster, and scandal. So like, disaster, Maine explodes near Spanish colony, right? And then so basically they blamed the Maine on Spain. And the title that they used for such press was To Hell with to hell with Spain, they sank the Maine, something like that. But they used very fervent words and very war-oriented, sensationalistic reporting words and titles to sell newspapers, which eventually led to the Spanish-American War, which is also known as the Splendid Little War because it only lasted about 6 months in 1898. And so McKinley's war message and the Spanish-American War was to put an end to the barbiturates, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries of the people in Cuba because they were suffering under the Spanish rule, as well as to protect the lives and property of the U.S. citizens living in Cuba, to end the very serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of our people, and to end the constant menace to our peace arising from the border of Cuba. And so after winning the war, the United States got Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, but they had to fight a war with the Philippines. Not only did they have to buy the Philippines for $17 million from Spain, they also had to fight a war against the Filipinos in order to actually acquire the territory. And so now let's get into Hawaii and the presidential diplomacies. And so the annexation of Hawaii happened mostly because they wanted a closer port to trade with China. It's also to trade with Japan, which was opened up forcibly by Matthew Perry because he brought the entire U.S. Navy blockade with him to Japan to force open it. And so all of this annexation is mostly for the ability to trade with China. And also, another reason why they annexed Hawaii was because of the people there wanting to uprise against the monarch, their queen. And so they helped with that, and then they said that they were helping to civilize their society there as well, which is an argument that is used repeatedly as the white man's burden. So now let's get into the presidential diplomacy. So you have Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. And so Theodore Roosevelt, describing his foreign policy, said that you were supposed to speak softly and carry a big stick. The press, applied the big stick to Roosevelt's aggressive foreign policy because he acted boldly and decisively in a number of situations. So the big stick is sort of a way to show that you are stronger. The man with the bigger stick is going to win in a fight. If you have a fight with a man with one stick and a man with a bigger stick, the man with the bigger stick is going to win. That's his big stick diplomacy. And so he would always carry a big stick and speak quietly in his foreign policy. And so you also have the dollar diplomacy, which is William Howard Taft's diplomacy. His dollar diplomacy was a way of promoting U.S. trade by supporting American enterprises abroad. This is why it's called the dollar diplomacy, because his foreign policy was focused mostly on acquiring wealth for the nation as well as the businesses in the country. And you also have Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. His moral diplomacy was a way to have, a moral relationship, a good relationship with all the other nations. And so Wilson had limited success applying a high moral standard to these foreign relations. He and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who you know from the last unit, hoped to demonstrate that the United States respected other nations' rights and would support the spread of democracy. Hoping to demonstrate that his presidency was opposed to self-interest and imperialism, Wilson took steps to correct what he viewed as wrongful policies in the past. So essentially he's saying that imperialism was wrong and that he was going to be correct, right and just in regards to the foreign policies with other nations. And so this is why he saw limited success in doing so, because he had to declare war in World War I in 1916. And so therefore he was not able to recognize the rights and the spread of democracy through his moral standard as well. And so that is very important to understand those three presidential diplomacies.